Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Wednesday seminar series hosted by the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. My name is Sheragim Janabzadeh. Today, we are delighted to have Professor Annie Pfeifer as our speaker. Professor Pfeifer is an assistant professor in the Department of Germanic Languages at Columbia University and is currently developing a project on the literary and philosophical exchanges between Iran and Germany. Her first monograph, To the Collector Belong the Spoils, Modernism and the Art of Appropriation, was published by Cornell University Press in 2023 and is currently being translated into Russian. As part of her new project, she has written a book chapter for the anthology Iran and the West, as well as a forthcoming article on Anna Marie Schwarzenbach's travel to Iran in the 1930s. In addition, her articles have appeared in various publications, including MLN, The New German Critique, German Quarterly, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the New York Times. Professor Pfeifer's lecture today, Ferdowsi in the Third Reich, examines celebrations in honor of Ferdowsi and the Shahnameh in 1934 Berlin, highlighting the symbolic importance that Iran played in the cultural and political life of the Third Reich. Please join me in welcoming Professor Pfeifer.
Thank you so much, Sheragim. Can you hear me? Yeah, great. First of all, I'd like to thank Sheragim and the Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies for this generous invitation. And I'd also like to thank Allison Cummins for all her kindness and help setting up my visit. I'm delighted to share my work with you today. It is a work in progress, so I look forward to your comments and questions. And I'll be showing a couple slides, and I have the German texts, but all of them have been translated into English. So if you don't follow the German, you can always look at the translations, which will be highlighted above. All right. On September 27th, 1934, the Nazi Ministry of Science, Education, and Culture held a 1,000-year celebration of the Persian poet Ferdowsi's birthday in cooperation with the government of Iran. The conference was organized by the high-profile German Orient Association, or as it's called in German, Deutsch Orientverein, and held at the Archaeological Institute in Berlin. Not only did German Orientalists and Nazi officials express, quote, immense gratitude, esteem, and indebtedness to Iran's rich literary legacy, they seized the opportunity to correct the misconception that Nazism was against foreign cultures, especially the Orient. Although the Aryan myth connection between Germany and Iran has been treated by David Motadel and others from a historical angle, the Ferdowsi millenary celebration in Berlin highlights the surprising importance of Iran in the Third Reich's early attempts at cultural self-definition. Drawing on various speeches and conference proceedings, this talk explores the way various speakers created a shared and imagined literary and cultural heritage between Germany and Iran, infused with Nazi ideologies. Nazis appropriated the Shahnameh for geopolitical and racial ends and recast ancient Persian history as a reflection of the German Romantic nationalist struggle. Arguing that it is Nazi Germany who weaponized a strategic cultural alliance with Iran to reinforce its racist, reactionary agenda, I seek to challenge the tendentious claims propagated by some scholars that Iran was an enabler of Nazi anti-Semitism. The historian Suzanne Marchand has demonstrated how the German field of Oriental studies, or Orientalistik, sought to legitimize itself during the Nazi period in a way that differed from scholarship in the 18th and 19th centuries. At the time of the Night of the Long Knives, she reports, the esteemed archaeologist Theodor Wiegand called on all of Berlin's Orientalist organizations to participate in a series of lectures on the subject of German Oriental studies. And it was called German Oriental Studies was the name of the lecture, its significance for the present and its tasks for today. That was this series of lectures. Less than 3 months later, the Ferdowsi Conference represents another milestone in this academic consolidation, or Gleichschaltung, under Nazi leadership. Left out of Marchand's analysis and overlooked in the secondary literature, the Berlin Ferdowsi Conference is an important case study that demonstrates the way the subfield of Iranian studies, or as it's known in German, Iranistik, tried to validate itself by making the long-standing literary and cultural affinities between Persianate and Germanophone realms relevant to Nazi ideology. And as you may know, there's a long tradition going back even further than Goethe, right, writing in the Divan, of sort of thinking about the cultural affinities between German culture and the Persianate world. While we know that Ferdowsi was actually born in 940, the commemoration of what was then presumed to be the millennium of Ferdowsi's birth was held internationally and in Iran in 1934. The Berlin Ferdowsi celebration was part of a worldwide event that was commemorated in universities, clubs, embassies, and publications in countries including the Soviet Union, France, the United States, and Egypt, among many other countries. Berlin celebration was attended by various dignitaries, including Iran's ambassador, Abu Qasim Khan Najm, who was reappointed as ambassador to France in 1937. A festrede was held by the prominent, this is him, Orientalist Hans Heinrich Scheder, who held a leadership role in several Nazi educational institutions and published in the Hitler Youth journal Wille und Macht, Will and Power. Even Alfred Rosenberg, who you may know as the notorious ideologue behind Nazi race theory and was also the author of concepts like Lebensraum, spoke to foreign students. Here's an image of him speaking to foreign students at an evening reception organized as part of the millenary celebration. And the translation is here. The Reichsleiter Alfred Rosenberg speaks at the reception for foreign students in Berlin, which was organized to celebrate the millennium of the Persian national poet Ferdowsi. In place of the Reich Minister of Education, Bernhard Rust, who was unable to attend the event, the ministerial director and chief of science, Karl Theodor Wahlen, addressed the attendees. A mathematics professor, Wahlen served as the first Gauleiter of Pomerania and was a member of both the SA and the SS. Wahlen declared, quote, on behalf of the imperial government, the high value which the German Reich places on friendly relations with the imperial kingdom of Persia, and to emphasize the great esteem in which Persian art and culture are held in Germany. He continued, as you know, National Socialism has often been misunderstood. Our conscious pride in our own Germanic culture has been seen as a rejection of the validity and value of foreign cultures. Here he uses the word Art eigene germanisch-deutsche Kultur, which again is an emphasis on the sort of racial Art eigene, emphasizes again the sort of racial connection between Germany and Iran. In particular, we have been accused of having no understanding of the high cultures of the peoples of the Orient. Wahlen assured the audience that the Reich Ministry would continue to welcome foreign sons into our universities to learn about German culture. And he led, finally, to the crowd to hail and bless Reza Shah. Perhaps most importantly, Wahlen exploited the alleged racial connection between Iran and Germany, claiming, quote, we know that our ancestors, the Germanic tribes, were related, and he uses the word Stammesverband, to the ancient Persians, and that the two great peoples belong to one and the same branch of the Indo-European family of primitive peoples. Here, Wahlen builds on the cultural and racial associations that began to coalesce after linguists discovered the structural affinities between Greco-Latin, Sanskrit, and Persian in the early 19th century. Along similar lines, the Iranian ambassador, Najm, claimed that Ferdowsi channeled a, quote, common heroic past of the Indo-German peoples, and they always use this term Indo-Germanisch to sort of emphasize the connection. Instead of Indo-European, it's noteworthy. We often hear the word Indo-European in English, but in German they use the term Indo-Germanisch. He added, quote, the name of our country, Iran, means Aryan country. The name of Aryans has remained alive to this day among the Persian and Indian-speaking members of this ancient family of nations. He concluded his speech by stressing the unity and friendship between Iran and Germany and praised the Führer. As the Sanskrit scholar Sheldon Pollock pointed out, the primary German cultural dichotomy in the 19th century of Germania and Rome was replaced by the Indo-German and Semite, partly in response to the social and economic emancipation of Jews in Europe. While Pollock's analysis focuses on Indology rather than Iran, he shows how Orientalism was part and parcel of Nazi ideology as it sought to legitimize itself through a myth of Aryan origins. And as is well known, in April 1933, the Nazi government issued the notorious Aryan paragraph, Aryan paragraph of the so-called Law for the Restoration of the Professional Civil Service, which became the regime's legal vocabulary to target Jews, using terms such as proof of Aryan ancestry or Aryanization. In 1936, a special decree of the Reich cabinet exempted Iranians from the restrictions of the Nuremberg race laws as pure Aryans. But as has been demonstrated in the later 1930s, they stopped using the term Aryan because it led to all sorts, or they sort of downplayed it and started using other terms, in part because of the confusion created by the concept Aryan and what exactly it entailed from the Nazi standpoint. Ultimately, according to Mortadell, it was research about Aryans and their Indo-Germanic links to Asia that kept the field of Oriental studies alive during the years of the Third Reich. One of the most prominent Orientalists to promote the Aryan legend was the aforementioned keynote speaker, and this is Hans Heinrich Schäder, who, quote, believed that the Northern European Aryans once colonized the Middle East and Inner Asia to defend their Nordic homeland against Asiatic hordes. Schäder drew particular parallels between ancient Persians and Germans. As one of history's most consequential malapropisms, the word Aryan was always a contested term that changed from philological to racial, pseudoscientific, and eventually political through the intervention of 19th century European Orientalists and eugenicists. This ambiguity made the word even more susceptible to misappropriation by scholars and lay people alike. From the Nazi perspective, an ancient epic like the Shahnameh helped to solidify these racial affinities in both intellectual and historical terms. In his speech entitled Ferdowsi and the Germans, Schäder declared, quote, Ferdowsi's poem is one of the great monuments to Indo-European destiny. He recast the Shahnameh in terms that resonated with the geopolitical situation of Germany in the mid-1930s. Although constantly entangled in wars, the Samanids and their governors were able to evoke and consolidate the national self-confidence of Persia. Das National-Selbstbewusstsein des Persertums is how he phrases it. The memory of its heroic legend and the great historical past of the Sassanid Empire. The Persian language, which had been repressed from public and literary life in favor of Arabic for almost 3 centuries since the Arab conquest, was restored to its rights as the language of historiography and poetry. As a model for Germany, who Nazis believed had been wronged in World War I and its aftermath, Iran had managed, according to Schäder, to restore its national self-confidence and revive its great historical past, in spite of being under siege by the Arabs. Most strikingly, Schäder foregrounds the Arab conquest's existential threat to the Persian culture and language. And what's striking here as well is that a similar linguistic argument was made in the early 19th century about the dangers posed by the Napoleonic invasions to the German language and culture. So you see exactly the same kind of rhetoric in Fichte and Herder, talking about the dangers of the sort of French influence, the Roman French influence, Latin French influence in German culture and language, and how German language itself had a kind of purity that was threatened by the sort of French other. And so one thing that happens in the 19th century is this sort of threat or locus shifts from the French other at the beginning of the 19th century to the Jewish other towards the latter half of the 19th century. What is notable about these statements is the way they allow Nazi Germany to flout its ostensibly anti-colonial credentials in contradistinction to larger colonial powers, such as Britain, France, and Russia, which had all gained a major foothold in the Middle East by the early 20th century. In other essays that he wrote, Schäder reiterates that the Germans, quote, never wanted anything but to bring peaceful forms of modernity to the East. Not only did such claims gloss over Germany's own colonial territory, particularly in Africa and the South Seas, they were glaringly contradicted by Nazi Germany's aggressively expansionist agenda. As Schäder's speech reveals, the Persian example, the one I just cited up here, serves as a warning against cultural mixing and subsequent degeneration. After describing the revival of Persian culture in the passage above, he continues, at the same time, however, this new development tended towards artificialization and over-refinement, especially the over-alienation of the Persian language with Arabic borrowings. The poetry of Ferdowsi's predecessors already shows that the Persian poetry succumbed to this danger. A man had to come along who spoke and taught a pure, or he uses the word rein, so pure in German, Persian out of an original and uninhibited sense of language. It is not difficult to see the Nazi parallels of Schäder's messianic, charismatic figure who restored purity to language and its people. The threat of foreign borrowing, exemplified here by the other Semitic form of Arabic, stands in for the threat of Jewish contamination to German culture. So they literally swap out or have the Arab threat stand in for the sort of more omnipresent Jewish threat in Nazi ideology. Along similar lines, in his notorious Myth of the 20th Century, which was written by Alfred Rosenberg, he described the old Persians as, quote, Aryans with northern blood who had finally degenerated because of mixing with lower races. So this was a common theme in Nazi ideology, the idea that the Aryans or Iranians had degenerated because of cultural mixing. Notably, the word that Schäder uses for over-alienation, he uses the word Überfremdung, of the Persian language with Arabic borrowings is the same anti-Semitic term invoked to describe the, quote, alleged overrepresentation of Jewish culture in Weimar Germany. So this word Überfremdung is literally grafted from Nazi discourse onto the Shahnameh. Like other speakers, Schäder tapped into the Nazi appropriation of romantic nationalist tropes dating back to the 19th century. Schäder's speech concludes with the hope that this German celebration will make Ferdowsi quintessentially popular, schlechthin volkstümlich, he says, among ordinary German people. Here's another quote. The German who immerses himself in Ferdowsi's verses today experiences more than an encounter with a foreign piece of poetry that only concerns the lover or researcher. He hears the call, and here he uses the word Anruf, of a familial fraternal voice from immortal verses thousands of years old, a voice in which the genius of a people of noble origin and high destiny, enduring in greatness and downfall, is encapsulated. Schäder's speech hits all the standard notes of Nazi romantic nationalism. the genius of a people, its noble origins and glorious destiny. Yet in keeping with the increasingly biological orientation of race theories, the, quote, familiar fraternal voice, or vertraute brüderliche Stimme, forges an alliance between Iran and Germany through blood and kinship rather than cultural affinities or literary sensibilities that had been emphasized in the earlier 19th century by people like Goethe, Friedrich Rückert, and 19th century German Orientalists. Scheder observes that it is not coincidental that the Shahnameh first gained traction in the Germanophone world during the period of nationalist fervor at the beginning of the 19th century, exemplified by the work of the Romantic writer Joseph Goebbels. He writes, during a passionate nationalist moment, he places the Persian books into the hands of Germans, whom he wants to lead themselves to the powers of their inner selves and the powers of their history. And this is a very strange argument he's making here. Given the fact that neither Germany nor any other nation, they're arguing, was in possession of a comparable epic poem, only the Shahnameh was able to instill these forms of liberation and self-determination. This is what Scheder is arguing, which is a pretty extraordinary admission, right, in a kind of Nazi gathering that's meant to promote German cultural supremacy. Thus, by Schéder's own logic, it is not a coincidence that Nazi Germany's renewed emphasis on the Shahnameh coincides with a far more virulent nationalist moment. 100 years after Goebbels' nationalist gesture, Nazis appropriated the Shahnameh to restore national pride following Germany's humiliating defeat in World War I and the punitive terms of the Versailles Treaty. So again, there's a kind of really like an analogous situation happening right at the beginning of the 19th century. It's the threat of the Napoleonic invasions, right? That's giving Germans solace in texts like the Shahnameh. And in the early 20th century, again, they turned to the Shahnameh as a sort of an attempt to gain self-esteem after the sort of humiliating terms of their Versailles Treaty. Lamenting the loss of the Iranian age of heroism, Scheder even seems to conflate Iranian knights with the myth of Germanic warriors chronicled in Tacitus's Germania, which is an old sort of early ethnographic text written in 98 AD by a Roman historian, Tacitus. Along similar lines, the speech by Theodor Wiegand, the president of the Archaeological Institute, praised the highest ethics of the Persian people as well as their knightly fighting prowess. The word he uses is ritterliche Kampftüchtigkeit. Wiegand marveled that the songs and deeds of the valiant Iranian princes show a surprising resemblance to German heroic sagas. The Nazi love for myth and pageantry, epitomized by the operas of Richard Wagner, had located another source of inspiration in ancient Iranian battles. Not only did Scheder use the Shahnameh to construct a distinct Iranian ethnic group with a shared history, he also did so by enlisting a mythic enemy located to the east, Turan. And he writes, or says, because it's part of a speech, the entire course of events is related to one theme, the fratricidal struggle between the Iranians and the people of Turan, brought about by blood guilt and blood revenge. Renewed from generation to generation, it is not compressed into a dramatic climax, but spans thousands of years. While the Turanians of the Shahnameh are an Iranian people representing the nomads of the Eurasian steppes, the term Turan became an ethnic and geographical term riddled with contradictions and ambiguities. Some scholars have speculated that the term derives from the Iranian term Tura, meaning hostile or non-Iranian land, and applied to the area beyond Khorasan, and subsequently regarded as the home of the Turks and other non-Iranian peoples. But its contested origins and fraught history make it susceptible to distortions and appropriations. The term Turan is not dissimilar, again, from the term Aryan, right, in all the ways that it's been used and abused Both terms have been used to make ethnic and racial distinctions between groups of people in service of nationalist, xenophobic, and even genocidal aims. But the Nazis did not need to bother historicizing the word Turan in order to pervert it into a reflection of what they deemed to be the timeless struggle between the Aryans and the Semites. Building on the selective historiography, Nazis as well as anti-fascists often depicted Iran as the cultural enlightened bulwark against what they deemed to be the uncivilized Turkish or Arab interlopers. And what's fascinating is you see this in people like Annemarie Schwarzenbach, who are sort of vigilant anti-fascists, but she's using the same kind of mythography in her depiction of Iran around the same time. This racist European framing of the Turkic, Mongol, or Arab others as the barbarian Eastern threat against Western adjacent Persian culture reinscribes many long-standing anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, and anti-Turkish biases. Schere's aforementioned references to blood guilt, Blutschuld, and blood revenge not only seek to ground Nazi ideology and thousands of years of racial struggle, they also anticipate the way blood and soil slogans culminated in calamitous bloodshed. Although it was nominally on the subject of Ferdowsi, the conference represents an important vector for the dissemination of racist ideas from Nazi Germany to Iran. As early as 1933, the Nazi Party established a branch in Tehran which disseminated anti-Semitic propaganda and sought to recruit new followers. Along similar lines, the Deutsch-Persische Gesellschaft, or the German-Persian Society, sponsored various publications, organized lecture tours, and generally facilitated cultural exchanges between the two countries. In a recent book, The Color Black, Enslavement and Erasure in Iran, Bida Baghoulizadeh shows that the emergence of racial categories such as black and white in Iran coincides with the adoption of the modern racial Aryan construct, paradoxically filtered through European Orientalism. She argues, during the 20th century, Iranians embraced the nationalist Aryan myth, the idea that they were the true inheritors of an Aryan past. The ideology of Aryanism and whiteness further built on the binary, embedding Iranians in a global worldview that connected them with Europeans and placed them at the top of the racial pyramid. Although the contours of the myth were formed during the 19th century, the Pahlavis, especially Reza Shah's successor, Mohammad Reza Shah, embraced and encouraged any connections, however flimsy, back to an imagined ancient white Iran. The Ferdowsi conference took place the year before Reza Shah officially changed the name of Persia back to Iran, to reflect its Aryan heritage. And again, that's sort of up for debate, right? Why exactly the name was changed around this period of time. As Ambassador Najm's aforementioned invocation of the Aryan-Iran connection suggests, cross-cultural engagements like the Ferdowsi conference most likely influenced Iran's own self-representation. Now, the conference proceedings do not reflect any explicit anti-Semitic rhetoric, which is itself sort of interesting, but nor did it have to. Speakers praised Hitler's greatness and affirmed Germany's rise and the possibility for renewed alliances between Iran and Germany without ever so much as uttering the word Jewish. Yet, the professed affinities between these Aryan cultures came at the expense of the Semitic other, the Jews following the footsteps of the Arabs who had threatened Persian culture and language centuries earlier. As much as it was predicated on hateful anti-Semitic slogans and discourse, Nazi ideology functioned through the systematic exclusion of Jewish contributions. Like Leni Riefenstahl's influential propaganda film Triumph of the Will, the complete erasure of Jewish people spoke as loudly as any racist slur or condemnation. In his speech, Scheder recognizes several Orientalists who were pivotal for the German reception of the Shahnameh, including Goethe, who I mentioned earlier, the poet-translator Friedrich Rückert, and the 19th century literary historian Adolf Friedrich von Schack. Yet there was one scholar who played an indispensable role in the celebration, but was noticeably missing from Schäder's speech, namely the German Jewish Iranologist Fritz Wolf. Wolf was not allowed to participate in any of the festivities because of his Jewish heritage. After Hitler came to power, he struggled to publish his monumental glossary to Ferdowsi's Shahnameh. This is a copy of the frontispiece. The product of 25 years of research that made the Shahnameh available to modern European scholarship. And it's about 1,000 pages long. It's an incredible, very detailed work that was done over 25 years. Nevertheless, in spite of the fact that Wolf was denied the possibility of attending the celebration, his glossary was selected as the official present of the Third Reich during the 1934 Ferdowsi celebration. So it was the present that was given to Iran from Germany, in spite of the fact that its author was not present. Schäder was able to persuade a cultural attaché to the German Foreign Office to have a preliminary copy of the book prepared for the festivities with the help of the Foreign Office, which also helped finance the printing of the final edition. And here's the title in full as it appears. It says, the glossary to Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, commemoration of the German Empire for the Millennium Celebration for the Persian Prince of Poets. And Festgabe is the sort of name they give it here. As Schäder wrote, it was the last great joy of a life overshadowed by increasing fear that he was able to see the publication of his glossary admirably carried out by the Reich printing house. After deciding to remain in Berlin against the advice of his friends, Wolf and his wife were deported to Auschwitz, where they were murdered in 1943. Schäder's omission of Wolf in the Ferdowsi celebration marks a striking contrast to the effusive obituary he wrote in 1950, 7 years after Wolf's death and 5 years after the Nazi defeat. And this is from the obituary that Schäder writes, where he declares, Fritz Wolf's name must not be forgotten. It is not easy to find the right words to commemorate him and his life's work. For how could we pay tribute to him and his scientific achievements without remembering in horror and sadness the end that was in store for him? And it's fascinating. I was sort of reading back through the obituary that he wrote and his constant use of constructions like "es ist nicht so leicht" or this kind of impersonal pronoun usage is really a way he's able to sort of disavow any kind of responsibility. And it's sort of linguistically, I think, very present in his writing. Not only does Schäder ignore his own loud silence about Wolf's contributions to his keynote address, he completely overlooks his own complicity in the Nazi system that culminated in Wolf's death, lamenting, quote, he was Jewish, and so he became a defenseless victim of Nazi persecution through years of growing suffering and humiliation, which he bore with the greatness of soul and courage. Schäder closes the obituary by quoting an account of Wolf's editor friend, who sort of recounts Wolf's last days, saying, it is still strange to me today how much more clearly he saw the fate of Jews than he was usually the case in Berlin. He knew that he and his wife would be killed, but out of a very deep Lutheran piety, he did not fear death. After converting to Catholicism, Wolf became a Lutheran Protestant in the 1930s, in part to try to avoid the fate that awaited many Jews in Germany during this time. According to this editor friend, Wolf's last words were, quote, tell my children that as a devout Christian, I am resigning myself to my fate and will die cheerfully. Compounding the tragedy of the persecuted Jew turned Christian martyr, Schäder tries to absolve himself from any responsibility by perversely insinuating that Wolf chose his own fate. Rather than admitting his own scholarship had contributed to a toxic ideology that ended in mass genocide, Scheder engages in an egregious form of historical revisionism. In contrast to Wolf, Nazism hardly interrupted Scheder's long career, but rather accelerated it. He continued to influence generations of important scholars, including the Harvard professor Annemarie Schimmel, who he was very helpful in encouraging her career, and the noted historian of Oriental religions, Carsten Kolbe. In 1944, Scheder assumed an important position at the University of Göttingen in Oriental philology and the history of religion, a position that he kept until his death in 1957. It is a particularly bitter and tragic paradox that Nazi Orientalism was built on the backs of Jewish scholars who were marginalized, expelled, and murdered. Along similar lines, the renowned German Jewish archaeologist Ernst Herzfeld was stripped of his professorship after the Nazis came to power. Although Herzfeld survived by escaping to the US, his students and colleagues denounced him to both the German and Iranian governments, published the results of his excavations, and then engaged in a systematic campaign to undermine his legacy, which was never restored. The field of German Orientalism has never been completely denazified, not only because its arcane knowledge continues to implicate generations of scholars with the work of their Nazi predecessors, but also because its victims, like Wolf and Herzfeld, continue to remain largely forgotten. In Orientalism, Edward Said observes the way that patterns of citation act as a form of power, noting, quote, "As a form of growing knowledge, Orientalism resorted mainly to citations of predecessor scholars in the field for its nutriment. Even when new materials came his way, the Orientalists judged them by borrowing from predecessors, as scholars so often do, their perspectives, ideologies, and guiding theses. Like decolonization, denazification involves breaking these chains of transmission to include forgotten and silenced voices." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Pfeifer. We have time for questions. If you could raise your hands.
Thank you so much.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
You're out for voice. Okay.
I found your talk really fascinating, and I have a lot of questions I'll pester you with later.
Great. I hope so.
But for now, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit. I mean, and you ended with this, but how all of this extends into the 40s, and I'm thinking about this really important context that you bring to these British postcards that were printed during World War II. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but the British printed a bunch of postcards with images from the Shahnameh, casting Hitler as Zahok. And so bringing that sort of imagery, and these were distributed amongst Iranians to sort of sway them towards the Allies. So bringing this, bringing the conference into this conversation, I think is really interesting. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, besides the officials that you mentioned, were there other Iranian attendees at these conferences? How does this exchange move forward through the decades? So thank you so much.
That's a great question. Thank you so much for raising that. And that's a fascinating connection, actually, that then the British picked up on this Shahnameh, but used it sort of as propaganda against Hitler. I think that would be an amazing way to sort of bring this, which I actually don't know too much about now. But thank you so much. I think that's a great way to extend the talk. And so just to sort of begin or make an attempt to answer your question, one thing that's clear, and you see this also from, I was looking at some of the correspondences from travelers to Iran in the late 30s, people like Annemarie Schwarzenbach, who is an anti-fascist involved with the Mann Circle, Thomas Mann, very active against Nazism. And she talks about going to Tehran in 1937, being in the German Legion. And wherever she goes, she talks about sort of the Nazi bookstores and the proliferation of Nazi propaganda in Iran at this time through the Germans. And this is post-1935. So it's interesting to think about how long actually that legacy and the German Legion was very powerful in Tehran at this time and continued to do so throughout the war. So I think it lasted a lot longer than might even be sort of initially evident based on the sort of the external political negotiations. So yeah, but it's a great question, and I think I should actually really think about the connection through the British postcards, which I'd love to hear more about. Yeah, that's great.
Very much. When you talk about basically Schrader's, work, and then, the way they looked at Ferdowsi, to me, it looks that they picked up the form and not the meaning, basically. If I put it in this way. But then a question comes to my mind is that, while they look at Ferdowsi and they try to use it for a different kind of, idea, what about the meaning within this book, when it comes to them? Because that Shahnameh is full of a story of justice. Right. And then it's a story of, wisdom, and then so many other things that actually contradicts what these people do. So that's why I say they picked up the form and not the meaning. So, do you see in any of this, work that they would encounter this issue? Mm-hmm. And then the whole idea that Ferdowsi's work was dedicated to a Turk, Sultan, Mahmud of Ghazna. So there are lots of, contradictions apparently here. So how would they German, deal with this issue? Or if there's anything, that they did.
Yeah, I think that's also a really good question. And I think what you said about the form versus the content is actually very, very apt in this case. I think they were very selective about their readings of the Shahnameh. And no speeches that I was able to read, did they ever really engage specifically with any stories from the Shahnameh, aside from maybe talking about the Turanians, right? And using them as this sort of foil for Iran as kind of, the enemy, the external enemy, right? But as far as I can tell, there was not a specific engagement among, at least in this sort of specific Berlin celebration. Now, I will say, of course, Shader, who was a trained Iranologist in that time, did know the Shahnameh and does cite references in other parts of the text. But what he's doing here for the specific Nazi occasion is being very selective about his readings, right? And even though they're presenting the glossary, right? This glossary, anyway, just going back to the glossary, where, this is an intense textual engagement. He's citing, Wolf is citing literally every single page of the Shahnameh, right? And organizing all of the entries with an intense, thank you very much. I think, again, there's really no effort to read below the sort of cover of the book in so many words. So I think your question is very on point. There wasn't really a sort of substantial engagement with the actual themes of the Shahnameh, the fight against injustice, other than just to sort of depict it as kind of part of this romantic nationalist struggle that very conveniently played into a kind of German self-mythology. But I think that's a good question to ask. Thank you.
I'm curious at what level this kind of involvement with Iranian culture took place in Nazi Germany, because in the 60s and 70s, if there was any cultural penetration beyond the academic level, it was reduced to the concern of the German Regenbogenpresse for the wives of the Shah, and some German academics' interest in getting Persian rugs from their Iranian students in connection with getting PhD awarded, and former Nazis who went through the mountains of Iran just pretending to be mountain climbers. There was very little else in the way of this kind of cultural concern in the regular society as opposed to academic society. And when I wandered around East Germany in the 70s, there seemed to be no presence of it at all in the East German academic society or the regular culture. So I'm curious.
In East Germany, maybe?
No, I said I was in East Germany and I didn't see very much of that at all. I mean, it was difficult to find serious academic work anyhow, but so I was curious as to what level this played out in Nazi Germany, because it sounds like it stayed at a level where very few other people other than academics appreciated what was going on.
Well, to use an example from West Germany in the 60s, right? I mean, the Shah's visit to Berlin in 1967 was basically the beginning of the student protest movement, right? That galvanized the 68. Right. They cared about Right. And there's that letter, that the open letter to Farah Diba that's written by Ulrike Meinhof, which is quite telling. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a valid question to always ask, right? To what extent is the sort of cultural, well, I won't call it high culture, but certainly the culture that's sort of foregrounded here, to what extent does it sort of pervade German society? And I mean, that's exactly, I think, the point that Schaeder wants to do, right? He says he wants to make the Shahnameh a household German text, right? So that's part of, he uses the word schlechthin volkstümlich. Volkstümlich means folk, of the folk, right? So he wants to make it accessible. He wants to make it a sort of part of, as you know, the Nazis are going through and revising history, right, based on fairy tales and other cultural myths. He wants to use the Shahnameh as part of that revisionist history. And I guess the answer is, whether he's successful is probably not so much, right, given how things ultimately turned out. But certainly that was his agenda. And that was part of the reason that this festival was happening, and was very prominently featured. And if you look at newspaper articles from the time, they were all sort of transcribing some of the speeches that were made. So it was a very sort of public event, right? There was another point that I wanted to make that I'm now forgetting, but maybe I'll remember it in a moment. I mean, and I think your other sort of question, which was maybe also lingering in the background, which is, to what extent is this a sort of deeper connection, right? I mean, Jennifer Jenkins in her work has really kind of uncovered also the economic motivations, right, between Germany's alliance with Iran, especially in the early 1930s, that it's part of this sort of grand economic plan that is deliberately orchestrating kind of the cultural. So in some ways, she's making the argument that actually below this sort of cultural apparatus is a kind of economic argument that is driving a lot of these kind of projects. So I think it's a complicated question, but I'm glad you raised it. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
So I had a follow-up question actually about connections. Mm-hmm. Because it seems like your talk really fits with the classic narrative of nationalism, namely that, you know, national identity is defined through differentiation and struggle and on the margins, right? And so you have all of these, in the case of Germany, they select Iran to emphasize difference with the Slavs, right? And so in that sense, there's actually a broader sort of Central European story to be told about connections to Aryanate, Persianate world, whereby not just Germany, but also the Baltics, Finland, also Croatia as a whole narrative of having Persianate roots. So I was thinking, to what extent is there an arena of these intellectuals in these different countries talking to each other within Europe about Aryanism and the Persianate world?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is there was a lot, right? I mean, if you just look at the sort of collaboration that was happening, and especially and again, maybe this is sort of earlier than the time period you're asking, but in the 19th century, right? The way that the word Aryan gets into the cultural discourse is initially through archaeological evidence, right? They sort of see that the word Aryan is used in various inscriptions. And then it quickly enters into the world of philology, right? Through the Schlegel. And then from there on, it becomes, through the French, becomes a kind of racialized term, right, after it becomes philological. So even in the circulation of the word Aryan, you actually can see how through the sort of, that you can map the discourses, right? It goes from archaeology to philology to race and biology by the end of the 19th century, just through all these sort of cultural vectors. Another person who I would mention is Gobineau, who wrote The Inequality. He's a French thinker who wrote on the inequality of human races, one of the very notorious early race thinkers who is being cited by Rosenberg and all of these sort of race theorists. And he's the one, he actually, I think, spends time in Iran and is also very influential in using the terminology of Aryan in this kind of context. So I think there is exactly so much cross-pollination that's in part what creates this kind of monstrous word that we now know today as sort of tainted with all this Nazi baggage, right? And it's partly through all these kind of points of contact that it has all these associations. But it's a good question. Why, did you have any immediate other thoughts? Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for this interesting talk. I was wondering, my question is more, you talked about sort of the tradition of, among German thinkers, of how to think of Persians as like a brotherly people, or, like from Goethe, you cited some philosophers too, and that's like sort of where the Nazis departed, or with the Nazi thinkers departed with their like story of Aryanism. Mm-hmm. And then you also mentioned that people in the opposition, like Annemarie Schwarzenbach, actually had the same sort of worldview about like the connections between Germans and Persians. So I was wondering, how did her thinking differ from that of the Nazi thinkers in the end, if they based on the same sort of understanding?
Yeah, that's a really important question that I'm actually trying to myself get a bit more clarity on. I mean, what's really interesting is that she takes this sort of trip. She has a very interesting history because actually her family are Nazis. So her mother has connections through Switzerland, through their industrial family to high-ranking members. And I think Hitler even visited her home when she was a child. She reported that he was always screaming and didn't like him. So from an early age, she really was a very oppositional figure. But one thing that's clear in looking at some of her travel narratives, so she takes various trips to Iran, but the first thing she does when she gets to Iran in 1935 is she joins an archaeological expedition, which again is kind of the classic mode of Orientalism, right, in this period of time. And so when she's talking about history, and she becomes very interested in Central Asian history, she always talks about the Mongol invasions, and she keeps referring to Genghis Khan as a sort of figure, like Hitler figure, right, who's coming in and invading, and sort of using, these sort of genocidal tactics. So again, I think she sort of maps on in a different way, but not sort of dissimilar from the way that Nazi historians or Nazi ideologues, I'll call them, because Rosenberg's a horrible historian. He's definitely not a historian by any means, uses history for kind of ideological purposes. But she does, I mean, there's definitely also evidence of sort of, even as anti-fascist as she is, she still has sort of kind of racialized ideas that, the kind of, not phrenology, but certainly there's kind of racialized readings that permeate her text, even as she's sort of very clearly disavowing Nazi ideology, which I think is just a sign of how pervasive this idea was at the time. But thank you. I think that's a great question.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm going to try to ask a very quick question. Basically, how much were the Iranian thinkers at the time influencing the particular vernacular that they were then using in their assessments of Ferdowsi? Like, how much the ideas of making it the Arabs or, like the nomads, because this is the moment when Reza Shah is also pacifying the tribes in Iran. Right. So how much of this is actually coming from Iran? So looking at it from the other direction, how much are they influencing the ways that then the German Orientalists are then interpreting Iran?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question to ask. And I think the answer is, at least if you look at Shadid, and you look at the chains of transmission, not much, right? I think much of what he's gaining are from other sort of German Orientalists. I think the people that he's citing are people like Goethe, people like Rückert, people who are coming from this long sort of philological German tradition of Orientalism. I think while they may have, they knew the language, but certainly I don't think there was much engagement with, historiography from the Iranian context. Even though at this moment, right, actually one of my other projects is thinking about the journal, which I know you've done work on too, Sharagim, on the Kaveh journal, right, which is taking place in Berlin in the 1920s, right? These kind of periodicals that are written by Iranian exiles living in Germany. So there's actually quite a few sources, even if they didn't want to go to Iran, living in Berlin at this time, that are very well versed in literary and philosophical history, but they're not citing them as far as I can tell. So there's very little engagement, I think, to think about on their end. So nothing that I saw. Yeah.
Very short extension of Negar's question, and thank you so much for this talk. But also, I was wondering, 1934 being the year of the establishment, or I don't want to say launch, but the word is evading me, of the mausoleum.
Yeah.
And so they also had delegates.
Right.
So I was just wondering again, like, were any of these figures present? And yeah, I had similar.
You mean of the German figures? Were they going to Tehran to the? Yes, yeah, they were. And in fact, some of them were sent as delegates to the Iranian celebration. I mean, they had Ferdowsi celebrations all over the world. So these people would sometimes travel from conference to conference attending. So certainly, absolutely, they were very involved. And, financially to some extent as well, they were bankrolling and sort of financing some of these publications. And the Reich Ministry printing house was also involved in helping, send these people to Iran for these state visits. So absolutely, I think there was a real sort of exchange there happening.
Yeah. They were also very proud of the copy of Shahnameh that they gave to Reza Shah, and they snickered at the gifts that the Soviet Union gave and the British gave, and kind of brushed it aside. But any other last remaining questions? Thank you so much, Professor Pfeifer.